Good morning, good morning, good morning. I think it's been a while. My name is Fatima Dozie, founder and CEO of Bossy Cosmetics. And hi, I'll be waving to everybody who joins. I will be chatting today with a really amazing woman named Viviana Waisman. She is the founder and CEO of Women's Link Worldwide, and she's also one of our nonprofit partners. And she's just joining. And it's really exciting to get a chance to introduce her to our community. As you know, Bossy Cosmetics is a mission-driven beauty brand, and one of the things that's most important to us is the partnerships that we have with nonprofits that, work on advocacy for women and girls around the world. And Viviana's organization, Women's Link Worldwide, is really an amazing organization that's done so much good in the world. They're a team of lawyers who, fight cases on behalf of women who are from, disenfranchised and vulnerable communities around the world. And I thought it was really important for our customers, our supporters, our followers to know more about the work that Bossy Cosmetic does beyond, providing beautiful makeup as I'm wearing today. We did one of these, I think 3 to 4 weeks ago. Looks like Women's Link is having a little bit of an issue joining, so I might ask her to join again. And if she's watching, you might need to update your Instagram app. We had this problem before. Hello, saying hi. I want to go live with, so I think it's really important to, as a brand that focuses on, hey! Hi! You just popped up. I was like, oh. How are you? Where are you?
I'm in Madrid.
Fantastic. It is so great to see you, even though we're seeing on a screen.
I know, it's really good to see you too.
Oh my gosh. So I was just saying before you joined, I do a bunch of these IG lives talking about beauty, talking about business, digital communities, all sorts of different topics. And one thing that we haven't done enough of is talk about our mission. And so we spoke to another one of the nonprofits that we support, which is based in Nigeria. And I really felt it was important for not only our customers to know where some of their money is going, but also our followers and just general community to talk about how you can be a mission-driven brand, right? And to live your values through business. And so welcome, Viviana.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
It's an honor to have you here. So I was talking a little bit about you before you came, but I think would love you to introduce yourself to the Bossy community, and then we'll just jump right into the work that that Women's Link Worldwide does. So welcome.
Thank you, and that sounds fantastic. I want to start off by really thanking you for creating this space to talk about women, women's rights, empowering women. It's really an honor for us at Women's Link to be able to partner with you and to partner with an organization that has such a great mission, and we share so many values. So I'm really honored. So I want to start by thanking you.
Thank you. Thank you back.
Yeah. And I guess just to introduce myself a little bit, I'm the CEO and president of Women's Link Worldwide. I founded the organization just shy of 20 years ago. I started off by myself in my study. Now I spend a lot of time by myself in my study.
Exactly, right. Full circle moment.
Full circle, except for now, I have this amazing team of 30 attorneys, communications folks, administration folks in 3 different continents, working across 3 different continents. So I am an attorney by training. I was educated and brought up in the United States, in California, where you are.
Oh, yeah.
And then my family's originally from Argentina. And my grandparents were migrants from Eastern Europe to Argentina. They're we're a Jewish family. They left in between wars, and then my parents actually had to flee Argentina in the 70s because of a political coup, and that's the reason I grew up in the United States. And then I've been living here in Spain for about 20 years, so it's my adopted country.
Wow.
So that's a little bit about me. And I'm really excited to talk a little bit about Women's Link and our mission and what's going on with
Absolutely.
women's rights.
Absolutely. So, before you just dive into, Women's Link Worldwide, I'd love to hear about how you came. So maybe tell us what your organization does.
Okay.
Many nonprofits that I know of, don't last for 20 years. So you have, this is your OG in the nonprofit space. So, over the course of the discussion, I'd love, because we speak to a lot of customers who are very interested in how to have impact, and they
Mm-hmm.
really do think about starting nonprofit organizations. So I'd love to, why
Sure.
Women's Link Worldwide? How did you start it? Why did you start it? Let's go with that first.
Perfect. Well, let me start off by telling you about our mission. I think you were talking a little bit about what we do, but we are an organization, a human rights organization. And what we do is we use the power of the law to advance the rights of women and girls, especially those that face different forms of inequality or are most marginalized in their communities, most disenfranchised, as you said earlier. And we work in three thematic areas: sexual and reproductive health and rights, violence, understood widely, violence against women, and then gender discrimination, but very importantly, how gender discrimination interacts with other forms of discrimination, be it race, ethnicity, migration status, where you live, whether you're in a rural area, poverty. And for us, it's very important that we work on these issues really all together, right? So we really look at what happens to women and girls, and women and girls don't experience discrimination or violence in a siloed fashion. And so
Mhm.
if you're working on issues of sexual violence, well, then it's very important to also consider the sexual and reproductive and health implications of a woman who's been a victim of sexual violence. We work in three continents. We have an office in Bogota in Colombia, in Latin America. We work in Latin America and the Caribbean. We have an office in Nairobi in Kenya, where we work in a couple countries in East Africa, a few countries in East Africa. And then we have an office in Madrid, where I am, where we do work in Spain and also a little bit more broadly in Europe, especially in Spain, working on issues of migrant women, women who have been victims of trafficking, a lot of what happens in the southern border areas
Yeah.
of Spain and Europe. When I say we use the law, what I mean is that we take on cases that we understand are representative of rights violations that a lot of women and girls are suffering, and we represent women and girls, and we're looking to both change the implementation of the law to make better laws through strategic litigation. But very importantly, we're thinking about how the cases, they highlight what happens to women and girls that is so often so invisible, especially those women that are so far away, the farthest away from justice. So that we think of them as like advocacy platforms,
Okay.
in which we do this in alliance, always with other organizations, national organizations, grassroots organizations, with a very strong component of communications around our work. Very important that women's and girls' voices be heard,
Mhm.
and that what happens in the rights violations that women and girls suffer be known, so that policies and laws can be adapted in a way that take this into consideration.
Okay.
So that's a little bit about who we are, and yeah, we've been around
For a
as I said,
while.
almost 20 years. Um,
Yeah. How
yeah,
did so
so
so tell me the burning thing that made you think this is something that I want to tackle, full time as a nonprofit, as opposed to maybe a volunteer, as a side hustle or whatever. What was it about this
yeah.
that made you think I want to tackle this from this
Mm.
specific angle, given that you're a lawyer?
Right. Well, I have to say that when I get asked this question, I often say something, and it's a little bit hard to explain, but I think I was born to do social justice work. Um,
I
I
know
didn't
you
realize
were.
this. I didn't realize this till later in life. I think even as a little girl, I was always just very concerned about injustices. I think it has a lot to do with my family, the experiences that my family has faced. I also grew up with a mother who I think is listening, who her social justice was teaching. Hi. Her social justice issue is teaching. She really used education as a way of advancing the rights of those in marginalized situations. And I think I learned a lot from her. And as I said, because of the political exile in which we lived and the history of my grandparents. And I think that's a lot of where my sense of justice comes from. And I studied political science as an undergraduate at Berkeley. And it was in my last year of college that I was taking a history class. And I think everybody who has been educated in the United States knows that in the United States, you tend to study the same now 200 some odd years of history, like over and over again. And for the first time, I sat in a history class. It was a political science class that taught history from a woman's perspective. And that was just it for me. Like I felt like I put on those purple glasses sometimes people talk about, like the gender lens.
Yes.
And I haven't. Once you put them on, you can't take them off.
I know.
You're always thinking about the impact on women, the impact on girls, and what happens in all the different communities around the world.
Yeah.
And then I volunteered. Didn't want to go to law school, but I had volunteered in a organization, a not-for-profit in San Francisco that was called Equal Rights Advocates. And they, what I was charged with was answering the helpline, women who had suffered discrimination in the workplace. And all I did intake calls, and then I would talk to the attorneys, and then I would get the information. I would call the women back who had been victims of sex-place discrimination. And I was so in awe of the power of information, of legal information, and how much there was a need for that. Okay. And I think it was when I was doing that internship that I decided I was maybe going to do public policy. I knew I was going to work on women's rights and social justice, but it was then that I decided that it was the law, and that was going to be my tool. There are a lot of tools to fight for justice, and that was my tool.
Yeah.
And I really started to see the law. I think the law is often used to maintain the status quo. That's kind of how people usually tend to understand it. And I really have been thinking about, and at Women's Inc., we use the law to break the status quo, to really think about how to give access to those people who don't have it. So that's kind of how it all started.
So I love that you said, there are lots of roads to this sort of fighting injustice. I often tell people, particularly in the US, in the last few months with social unrest around, racial issues, I often tell people that there are multiple roads to advocacy. And you chose a road, right? And a very specific road to use your legal background as a nonprofit. But there's so many different ways to support so many different things, particularly around women. And one thing that I think has been really interesting just in my own journey here in the US, I'm originally from Nigeria. And so I'm quite familiar with issues around sex trafficking. And when I speak to people in America, and I don't know if this is shocking or not, they generally don't think that there is a trafficking situation any longer. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, some of the myths that you dispel in your work, and some of the surprising things you'll see. I'll share another thing. We did an IG Live, I think about a month ago, where the CEO talked about a shadow pandemic. And she said right now, when a lot on women are being locked up, she was referring specifically to Nigeria, at least people, not women, are being on lockdown. Right. She has seen a bigger incidence of domestic violence, gender-based violence, and child abuse, and even child rape. So I'd love for you to kind of talk about, very topically, your work, and to people just to almost take the shield off, because a lot of people may not know how bad things are for women around the world.
Yeah. I mean, those are so many questions. Let me try to unpack. You asked a bunch of questions in one. So, I mean, I think that one of the myths that we work very hard to undo is that once you have a good law in place, that's enough. A lot of times, and that when there's a legal framework that that prohibits discrimination on any ground, then you're done.
Yeah.
And we at Women's Things we focus on the judiciary, on judges, and because we focus on the implementation of the law. Because I think what people don't know is that there's so much gender stereotyping that takes place when women try to access justice, that if you don't apply the law with a gender perspective, and that's the obligation of the judges around the world to do so, then women actually don't have access, even if the legal framework is good. And so, we work and live in countries where the legal frameworks, both international and regional, national legal frameworks, they ensure prohibition against discrimination. But the truth is that women continue to suffer discrimination across the globe, violence being the most extreme form of gender-based discrimination. And that unfortunately, violence is hugely prevalent everywhere. Trafficking is an example of a severe form of trafficking. Actually, there's a lot of human rights violations that are involved in trafficking. And there is a lot of invisibilization. I don't know if that's a word in English. I don't know if it's a word in the language. But what happens to women and girls just remains invisible. And I think that the example that you're giving of what's happening during the COVID pandemic is a good example of what people don't see. So I think that the example that you say of the person who you were speaking to about the rise in violence, domestic violence in Nigeria, this is something that we have seen everywhere we work. A huge rise in domestic violence. And during the pandemic, and something we've been working on at Women's Thing quite a bit, is at the same time that there's a rise in domestic violence, sexual violence, that at the same time there's been court closures across the globe. And so one of the things that we've been working to do is, how do you make sure that there's an understanding that it's an essential service to have a woman who's been a victim of violence be able to access justice, so that what courts are open, like what's included as emergency or urgent, has to include if women are being victims of violence. At the same time, one thing that, something that we know has been happening, which is really tragic, is there's an increase in violence, sexual violence, including of, girls and adolescents. And at the same time, women and girls having a harder time accessing contraceptives, access to abortion, because they're either in lockdown or because the services are shut down. And so, the United Nations has estimated that, let's see, the numbers are just horrific. I think like some 47 million women in low and middle income countries were going to be not able to use modern contraceptives during the pandemic.
Wow.
And so like in a 6-month period, it could lead to approximately 7 million more unintended pregnancies. Yeah.
Wow.
So this is the kind of thing that I think is not as visible to everyone who's thinking about what's happening to the pandemic and during the pandemic, or the fact that in so many countries, the informal sector, women and girls are overrepresented in the informal sector. In sub-Saharan Africa, they're like 92% or something of the informal sector. And so there's just a disproportionate impact on women and girls. In terms of trafficking, when you close borders, women and girls who have no option but to migrate, it increases trafficking. Because it's like, at that point, traffickers have an easier time targeting women and girls who are in vulnerable situations. So there's a rise in trafficking. So all these things are happening at the same time that all the other issues are ongoing in terms of like the pandemic and everything that everybody is dealing with. Wow. So those are some of the things that are going on that I think are just, they're invisible until you kind of stop and think about it and ask, okay, well, how is this impacting women and girls? And what does this mean for somebody who needs to access prenatal care and they don't know if they can go outside or not? Yeah.
So tell us, one of a case that's near and dear to your heart that you guys worked on, just to kind of give us a flavor of the work that you do and the impact. Do you mind?
Sure. Yeah, no, that would be fantastic. Actually, all the cases we work on are, so let me start with one, and then if we have time, I'll talk about that. Okay. Last year we had one of the countries that we work on in East Africa is Rwanda. And we have very good partners in Rwanda. And one of the things that we were working on last year is the case of a woman who was facing a life sentence when she was accused of infanticide.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay. So this case was complicated. So this woman is from a rural area, and she very poor. And when she became pregnant, she lost her job, and her partner left her.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And when she was very far along in her pregnancy, she went to the hospital, and they told her that she needed to pay for the medications that she needed because those weren't available in the hospital for free, and she didn't have the money to buy them. So she went home and she gave birth by herself, and there were complications during the birthing process, and the baby died. And the story is horrific, and when she was accused of infanticide, one of the things that happened, which is, I think, talks a lot about like who has access to justice and why we work for women who are in the most marginalized situations. She didn't have access to legal counsel.
Yeah.
And she actually didn't have access to legal counsel in the first two instances. And she was actually told by somebody that if she pled guilty, she'd have a lighter sentence. And so she's just got herself into this legal mess. We started to work on the case when I was before the Supreme Court in Rwanda. And what we did in that case is we really highlighted.
Was she in jail?
She was in jail. She was in jail with a life sentence. And what there's advocates, of course, working in Rwanda on these issues. And one of the things that they had found through some research they were doing is that there were, Rwanda's not a very large country. There were like over 200 women that were in jail for pregnancy-related crimes. So they were in jail either accused of abortion or infanticide. And when you look at these cases, what you see is that women are being jailed basically for being poor and pregnant. Yeah. And so many of these pregnancies also, unfortunately, are results of rape. And so as we worked on the case, what we did is we provided the Supreme Court in Rwanda with information about how the discrimination that this woman who was our client and others in similar situations face because of poverty, because of being in a rural area, because she has had a lack of access to education, and how these intersecting reasons that she has suffered the discrimination are really the reason that she's being jailed, and how access to health needs to take place without all those different discriminations.
Yeah.
And the case, as you might imagine, is hard. I mean, they're really difficult issues to litigate. And so as a result of our intervention and the intervention of the council, this council that we work with in Rwanda, this woman's sentence got reduced to 10 years. And then shortly thereafter, there was a presidential pardon. Oh, no. Because of the pressure, and she and all these women that had been in prison, they were released. And then there was an important change in the criminal code in which there was a reduction in the sentencing for this kind of crime. And now we're working to see if we could get this crime out of the criminal code. Exactly. Wow. So that's an example of some of the work that we're doing around reproductive health and women's rights to have access free of discrimination.
Wow, that's amazing. And I'm assuming that she didn't pay for this legal support?
No, I think that's one of the things I think is really important. And as a not-for-profit organization, of course, we cover all the costs, and we work a lot of times with organizations that do legal aid, because that's how we find these cases that have the potential of setting precedent and making the sustainable change. And we never, of course, charge because we really are always looking to represent women who don't have access to justice because of not having attorneys, or because of the discrimination they're facing, because of the stereotypes. I think another example that really brings to life the kind of stereotypes that we're talking about is we represented a woman in Spain who had been the victim of domestic violence for many years. And when she had a 3-year-old daughter, she finally was able to separate from her abuser. And for the 3 years that followed that separation, she sought protection. She had over 30 different cases open in different courts around Madrid. And what was happening there is
This is to protect her from her abuser.
Her and her daughter, yeah, because
Okay.
he kept abusing, he kept being threatening her and showing up at the school, and these things that you often hear happen to victims of domestic violence. And what was happening is that the stereotypes that were at play were making it so that no one would believe her. And I think some of the stereotypes that we talk about, what are gender stereotypes? And they're, we all have stereotypes. We all function with stereotypes.
Of course.
Yeah, because you can't figure everything out all the time. The issue is when you take a stereotype and you apply it without looking at the specific case, that turns into discrimination.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's really the job of the judicial system to not do that, to look at the particular case. And, there's a lot of stereotypes around women lying or manipulating about violence in order to get custody of their children, about women exaggerating, like all these stereotypes play against a woman being able to access the protection she needs often when she goes to court. I often say, that why does it happen that a woman would go to file a complaint, a sexual violence complaint, and she wouldn't be believed? I mean, when have you ever heard of somebody going to say that their car got stolen and the police saying, wait a second, are you sure your car got stolen? Like, didn't you maybe just lose your car? No, that doesn't happen, right?
Exactly. Our last guest that we had talked about the low percentage of women who say they were raped and that it's a lie. And that the preponderance is always to believe the woman who says so because of what will come down on her after she has made this accusation. Right. The majority of women don't want that. So if they are saying this is happening, it's probably happening.
Right. I mean, and then that's why you have a judicial system, where the person who's accused gets a defense, and it could be, there could be an investigation. But what ends up happening when women denounce sexual violence is that she gets questioned. Where were you doing? What were you wearing? Who were you with? Like, were you drinking? All these things that happen in these sexual violence cases, including like in these like gang rape cases that happen all over the world. There's all these questioning of the woman, as opposed to putting the focus on the person, the accused, and questioning what they did. And so there's all this weight put on the woman to prove that she was raped, for example, right? And that's what I'm saying. It's like that doesn't happen with other crimes. And so I think that really shows how gender stereotyping and discrimination impacts a woman's ability to access justice, even though the law might be, in theory, gender neutral. So this is a lot of what was happening to Angela, the woman we represented in this violence case. And the story is really very tragic. Unfortunately, the cases we work on are very tragic, but she was fighting to make sure that the visitation rights that the father had were always supervised. And, he actually won that battle, and he got some unsupervised visits. And in one of those unsupervised visits, he killed the little girl who was 6 at the time. And then he committed suicide.
Oh, no.
The story is terrible. And the thing is, unfortunately, we see this kind of situation quite a bit in which the abusers use the children to really, to continue to abuse the women.
This is awful. What advice do you have because I know that a lot of women who are probably going through this violent situation will probably decide not to leave the home, because at least if they sort of are the buffer for the abuse, at least their child continues to live, right? What advice in the cases that you've seen, what do you say, especially to a woman who, is in this vulnerable situation and, socioeconomically cannot afford, a Gloria Allred? What do you say to a woman who doesn't have the purse to hire a very expensive lawyer? What do you do in this situation where you suspect your life and the life of your child is at risk?
It's such a good question that unfortunately doesn't have like one good answer. I do think that fortunately in most places around the world, there are not-for-profit organizations or legal aid that specialize on issues of violence against women. That's why women's rights organizations are so crucial. So that there's to seek out some support. I think that there's no blanket advice that can be given, because every situation needs to be studied, examined, and making sure, first of all, that whatever is done is exactly what the woman wants to do. and that there is as much safety put in place as possible before any decision is made about, trying to separate or leave, because I think that a lot of times, unfortunately, when these separations occur, there's a higher incidence of violence that takes place. So it's really important to be able to seek the advice of experts on violence and to be able to talk to somebody. So, looking for organizations, wherever you are, that dedicate themselves, whether it's psychological support or legal support or some other kind of support, is really important as a first step. And talking to people. And I think also just not being ashamed. I think so many times women, they're silent because they're embarrassed, as if it was somehow their responsibility that they're being the victims of violence. And I think that that's another myth we have to bust. And that women need to, and it's part of the empowering, right? Like it's not, and that violence occurs, unfortunately, across nationalities, across ethnicities, race,
everywhere, region, everything.
Right. And so it's just important, I think, to keep that in mind, that it's not your fault if you're and that not to take the responsibility for it, and to seek some help. Yeah.
What have you found in terms of when you're interacting in the judiciary in some of these countries? What have you found? Because our last guest talked about doing some training, which I never thought about, for police officers to really teach them, how to question, a woman,
right?
What is the sense? How do you handle these questions? What do you do immediately she walks in? How do you, get her to get medical support for the rape kit? And also to judges. They were doing a lot of training of police officers, people in the court. And then she also said they did a lot of work in villages. So they started talking to a lot of the older women to say, listen, this is happening in your community. This is how you deal with it. So what have you found in terms of, dealing with the judiciary and tackling these issues? Are they open? Has it been hostile? What is it like?
That's a great question. And I think going back to the conversation we're having before about there's so many tools, and certainly training and education are fundamental tools against gender discrimination and violence. One of the things that happened in this case that I was telling you about that we litigated, we took that case all the way to the United Nations committee that's charged with issues of discrimination against women. And we actually won the case. The case was filed against Spain. And this committee, which is called the CEDAW committee, came out with a decision that was really important, because what it did is not only did it acknowledge the negligence of the state in protecting our client Angela and her daughter, but it also gave recommendations, a roadmap of how to improve. And one of the things that was in the roadmap is exactly what you're referring to, which is the training of judges and others in the judiciary on what it means to apply a gender perspective, how to avoid gender stereotyping. I think that you find everything in the judiciary. You find some judges who are willing but don't have the capacity, so they need some of the know-how. Those are the best to work with because they're open to understanding what information they don't have. Then you find some who aren't willing and don't have the capacity. Those are the hardest. So you find sometimes you have those that have the capacity but not the will. And so what we do at Women's Inc. is we really hone in on where is there will but not capacity, so that we can really make a lot of inroads with the work that we're doing. It's really important because there are so many judges that are committed to ending discrimination and ending violence, and what kind of cases can advocates around the world take to those judges to help set those precedents and change our societies from that perspective.
Yeah. One of the things that, just being from Nigeria, and I know that you do a lot of work in Latin America, which is, at least from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, sort of this very machismo personality and, just stiff upper lip. And so I know that in Nigeria, if you, unless your husband has beaten you until you faint, generally it's looked at as a woman's issue. And, what did you do wrong is the first thing you'll be asked if you say your
Yeah.
husband hit you, it's generally the burden is always on the woman. And so I think before one even gets to having legal representation, at least from what I've seen, is dealing with the societal, I don't know, or cultural perspectives around a lot of these issues, because you need to have surmounted that to seek legal redress.
Right.
And I don't know if I guess you only come in at the point where the woman has decided she's had enough. But there's probably millions of women who tolerate a lot of things and they never get to the point of seeking legal support.
Yeah, I mean, I think that your observation is right on mark. And I wish I could say that it's in Latin America that there's machismo. I think it's a global issue, unfortunately, different degrees, and that's why there is so much violence everywhere in the world. I think that one of the things that we do, and it's true that we represent women we have similar objectives, the woman's objective and our objective. And then we try to, make sure that the environment is such that it's an enabling environment to make this change that we want to do. But I think the important thing about using strategic litigation as a tool to do this is that it allows us to set precedent and visibilize. And that also is a step towards what you're saying, is how to create public debate around what discrimination is, how rights should be implemented. What's a human rights violation? What is not a private issue? I think one of the most interesting things that has happened recently is that, it was in the 70s that I think for the first time issues of domestic violence and what happened to women starts being there was this public-private divide that was broken, right? And and it stopped, this saying that happened in the 70s is like, the private is public, right? Yeah. Because it's not a private issue, and it would happen that a woman would call the police, and the police officer say like, that's
a private matter.
That's your issue, right?
Yeah.
And I think that what we've seen most recently is another breaking of the silence. With the Me Too movement, and it's this breaking of the silence of, wait a second, there is so much violence against women, and discrimination is so prevalent. But we're also silent about it. And there's this breaking of the silence that occurred, just very similar to the breaking of the silence that's happening around racism right now in the United States and around the world. And it's like, especially those of us who work in social justice or have that understanding of what's happening in the world, it's not news to us, but it is news to a lot of people. And so when you break that silence, I see it as like, you open up a door, and once it's open and you've got the young people, the young girls, the young activists out there demanding their rights, there's no going back. And so I do think that that's the way we're on. And it's a difficult road as we see on all these issues, on gender discrimination, on racism, on, the intersection between racism and gender discrimination. Yeah. But these strategic litigation cases and other efforts are just the opening up of a public debate that needs to happen about how rights should be implemented and what it means for women to be able to speak up about what happens to them.
So I love that you brought up the Me Too movement, because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, my impression with the Me Too movement is it's really been seen, in the professional sphere of women, and thinking more around workplace discrimination, pay equality. So definitely not women, at the sort of more vulnerable socioeconomic status. Yeah. But it's interesting that you bring that up do you see that as sort of the rising tide, carries everyone? Have you seen the Me Too movement be supportive in the work that you're doing, kind of catalytic, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. I know there's been a lot of criticism of the movement, and I think that what you're saying is true, that there's a need to make sure that you're advocating for those who can't speak up, right? Because, there's been talk about who it is that can speak up. And I think this makes me think a lot about, I often talk about why we work. When you look at our mission, and we work with women who are in the most marginalized situations. And the reason we do so is because I often think about, like, if you think about justice as being like a circle, I think of it as a red dot often. And you think about, who is closer to justice and who's farther away from justice. And you think about women who suffer multiple forms of discrimination or situations of poverty. they're like on the most outer limit. Women who are victims of trafficking, I often think, are very much on the very outer limit. Their situation is so invisible, and they're fleeing situations of poverty and discrimination and violence, right? If you think about that circle, what we do at Women's Inc. is we work to push those women that are farthest away from justice closer to that red dot.
Oh, that's a beautiful imagery. Beautiful.
And what that does, it pushes all of us closer to justice, because you're right that if you only if you are working on those women who are closer, then those other women get farther and farther from that red dot, and that's what you want to avoid. So, that's the our idea behind the work that we do.
Sure. Okay, so I have two questions
Okay.
before we wrap up. One is, I'll tell you both of them. One is, are you hopeful? Where, just given what we're going through now, I mean, it's really hard to see beyond this pandemic, but are you hopeful with respect to the work that you're doing and the fights that you are having in terms of those women? Every woman at every level from that dot you've talked about is fighting, right? Are you hopeful for the woman on the outskirts? That's the first question. The second question, I want to talk about, how do you fund what you do? And, I want people to really understand, we've talked a lot about the importance of the work that you've done. And then I want to talk about how people can support financially the work that you're doing. So those are my two questions before we wrap up.
You asked hard questions. Let me try. So I am hopeful. I'm not hopeful every day. I think saying that I'm hopeful every day would just not be true. Yeah. I mean, these are hard times. They're hard, but they're hard times. And I think that, some days it's hard to be hopeful, but overall, I'm very hopeful. I really have the privilege of leading this amazingly fierce group of human rights activists, and that gives me a lot of hope, and the women we represent and their bravery gives me a lot of hope. I'm hopeful because I think that the combination of what's happening with the pandemic and the movements around anti-racist movements are really highlighting something that we've been talking about for years. It's hard to explain, but I think is really becoming crystal clear now, which is what structural discrimination means. What it means that discrimination is so widespread and so deep that you need to dismantle systems. You need to work against the status quo in order for there to be real access to justice. And I think that the fact that language is something that you hear quite a bit now really does give me hope that there's an understanding of the need to work for those women and girls who are in the most marginalized situations, and to visibilize what happens to them. I think that there's hope there amongst the difficulties. And it's when things are really hard, when there's a lot of crisis, which is when women and girls experience a rise in human rights violations, it's also an opportunity to put women and girls at the center of the solutions, which is what we're fighting for at Women's Inc., right? To make sure that women and girls are at the center of the solutions. Yeah. So that's my answer to whether I'm hopeful or not.
I'm happy to hear that. Without hope, there's nothing left. So
there's nothing left. Yes.
All right.
Yes.
And how do you guys do this work? How do you do this work?
It's a very important question. And you asked earlier about whether we charge. And of course, we don't charge anything. And we're attorneys, which means that, we have salaries to pay in order for these great people to be able to work with us. We are funded mostly by private foundations and individuals. And this is really important. The way we're funded that is actually a really important issue for us, because we don't accept any government funding because we litigate against the governments. And so we need to remain independent so that we could take on cases and really respond to the rights violations that are taking place. So it is actually, through these individual contributions that we're able to take these kind of cases on to make the change that we're all hoping for.
Yeah, and so just to give us some context, on average in a year, how many cases are you litigating?
I'd say we have between 10 and 15 active cases at once. Each case we really work on very much in depth. Sometimes we're doing amicus, friend of the courts for cases sometimes. So there's different, ways of working on these legal processes, but approximately that much. And again, we don't work on the cases alone. We really do partner up with organizations in the different countries where we work on.
Wow.
So that's approximately.
So every dollar counts.
Every dollar counts.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, listen, I mean, this has been phenomenal. Thank you for the work
Thank
that you do
you.
in this world. I kind of feel, that the honor of running a beauty company, which I love doing, it was kind of my thing to say, okay, if you're going to do beauty, you really have to do beauty that's helping, helping women in the
Yes,
world, right?
it's fantastic.
And, we think that it's very special what we do because we focus on working women and really helping them think about how to ignite confidence in themselves so that they can level up and they can work harder and they can work smarter. We want to close the pay gap. We want all women to rise. We want all women to shine. And we definitely think that just because you want to wear lipstick or whatever has nothing to do with
Right.
or is not in contradiction to wanting to help the most vulnerable in society. And so it is hugely a part of our DNA to do these two things together. And I felt like, in the last year, we've been so busy launching products and all this stuff that we really haven't told our customers where some of their money is going and where it could be going additionally. So thank you for the work that you do. I know that
Thank
it's
you.
hard and we want to support you in any way that we can. And so this week we did this IG Live to introduce you to it'll be
Fantastic.
on our IG page forever. And our customers can see that, a percentage of their proceeds are going to organizations like yours to fight, legal systems and to create precedent to support women in the future.
Thank you so
So
much. And we really are so grateful for the partnership and the way that you have focused your company and your work is really fantastic. So congratulations.
thank
Uh,
you.
and
Stay
thank you so much.
healthy.
You
Stay
too. Take
healthy,
care.
Viviana. Thank you
You
so
too.
much for making the time. It was really
Thank
awesome to
you.
get to speak to you. Take
Likewise. Take
care.
care. Bye.
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 So that was my time with Viviana. If you missed it, we'll put it up on our IG page and you'll get a chance to watch the whole video. She's an amazing woman. She's done some really amazing work. For us, I want to spotlight women like her, women in the world who are ambitious, women in the world who are building businesses. I always talk about personally myself as Aisha as being a champion of women in business. And then as a brand owner, I really, really want the DNA of our brand to be, mission first. And our mission really is to elevate the voice of women in society, is to ignite confidence in women, is to support women in any journey that they commit themselves to. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for joining. Hi from Chile. Oh, wow. Yeah, I think we've got a big international crowd today. Thank you so much for joining this IG Live. And I think it's just important to say that we always donate a percentage of our proceeds to the nonprofits that we partner with. And if you'd like to donate additionally when you're shopping on the site, you can round up your purchase, or you can elect to give an additional $1, $2, $3, $4, $5 directly to those nonprofits. Thank you so much, and we'll be in touch soon. Bye.